The deployment of U.S. warships near Venezuela during the Trump administration raised one of the most contentious debates in modern geopolitics, combining issues of American foreign policy, regime change ambitions, the crisis of legitimacy in Latin America, and the wider global rivalry involving Russia and China. And to understand the significance of this moment, it is important to revisit the context of Venezuela's internal crisis, the motives of the United States under Donald Trump, and the role that other great powers play in this increasingly multipolar world. Venezuela, once one of the richest nations in South America due to its vast oil reserves, fell into deep economic, political, and humanitarian turmoil under the leadership of Nicolás Maduro, who inherited power after the death of Hugo Chavez, and since then the country has witnessed hyperinflation, mass poverty, shortages of food and medicine, and a mass exodus of millions of people into neighboring countries, which gave the U.S. and its allies an opportunity to denounce Maduro as a dictator clinging to power through fraudulent elections, repression of dissent, and brutal security measures, while simultaneously supporting opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the legitimate interim president. But the U.S. strategy went far beyond rhetoric, as Washington consistently pursued sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert pressure, while Trump in particular flirted with the idea of direct military intervention, which was evident when U.S. warships began to circle near Venezuela under the pretext of fighting drug cartels, a justification many analysts dismissed as a cover for the more aggressive ambition of regime change, because history shows that the U.S. has often used indirect justifications, such as humanitarian concerns or anti-drug campaigns, as pretexts for interventions in Latin America, recalling episodes in Panama, Grenada, and elsewhere. And this raised the question, was Trump's foreign policy in Venezuela really about drugs, democracy, or rather about expanding U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere at a time when China and Russia were gaining unprecedented influence? China, over the past 2 decades, has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil sector, loaning billions of dollars in exchange for future oil supplies, while Russia provided critical political, financial, and military support, even sending mercenaries from the Wagner Group and deploying strategic bombers as a symbolic gesture of defiance against Washington, making Venezuela not just a local crisis but a node in the global contest between Washington and its adversaries. And for Trump, obsessed with projecting strength, a military posture near Venezuela offered both domestic political advantages and international signaling, because at home he could present himself as tough on socialism and defender of freedom in America's backyard, appealing to Cuban American and Venezuelan exiles in Florida, a crucial swing state in U.S. elections, while internationally he could challenge Moscow and Beijing by putting pressure on one of their most important allies in the Western Hemisphere. Yet the danger of this strategy was escalation, because unlike past regime change operations where the U.S. enjoyed overwhelming dominance, the Venezuelan theater was already heavily intertwined with rival great powers, meaning that any attempt at toppling Maduro could invite a strong pushback from Russia and China, whether in the form of economic retaliation, arms shipments, or diplomatic blockades in the UN Security Council. And this is why analysts warned that Trump's approach, cloaked under the narrative of fighting drug cartels, could actually trigger a wider geopolitical clash, possibly even leading to confrontations that would destabilize not only Latin America but also reverberate across global security systems, since both China and Russia had vested interests in preventing another US-backed regime change, having learned from the experiences in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, where interventions often left chaos but strengthened U.S. influence, and thus they were determined not to lose Venezuela, one of the last remaining allies challenging U.S. dominance in the region. And so the presence of U.S. warships symbolized more than military maneuvers. It was a message that Washington was willing to use hard power to achieve its objectives, but the risks included unintended consequences such as prolonged proxy warfare, further economic collapse in Venezuela, greater refugee crises across Latin America, and deepening of Cold War-style tensions at a time when the world was already facing polarization. And one cannot ignore the irony that while Trump publicly spoke of ending America's endless wars, his administration pursued aggressive stances in multiple regions, whether against Iran, China, or Venezuela, exposing the contradiction between rhetoric and action, and raising questions about whether the U.S. was truly shifting toward restraint or merely rebranding its interventionist tendencies, because critics argued that Trump's obsession with regime change, especially in socialist states, was driven less by strategic necessity and more by ideological and political motives. Yet the global implications remained profound, for if Venezuela were to become the next battleground of great power competition, Latin America could be thrust back into the role it played during the Cold War, where countries were divided into spheres of influence, proxy wars erupted, and sovereignty was often compromised by external interventions, and so the sight of U.S. warships circling Venezuelan waters became a symbol of a dangerous game, where the struggle for power, resources, and influence risked dragging the world into another prolonged confrontation, and ultimately, the crisis surrounding Venezuela was not just about Maduro or Trump, but about the future of global order, whether the 21st century would continue under U.S.-dominated unipolarity enforced through interventions, or shift toward a multipolar world where Russia, China, and regional powers resist American dominance, and in this sense, the Venezuelan standoff under Trump was a test case for both the resilience of the Maduro regime, the limits of U.S. power, and the willingness of China and Russia to confront Washington in its own hemisphere, making it one of the most illustrative examples of how local crises in the modern era are inseparably linked with global rivalries, and how military gestures, like the deployment of U.S. warships, may carry consequences far beyond their immediate theater, shaping the trajectory of international relations for years to come.